To watch all of my exclusive content not featured here on my channel, log on to my website at imjustheretomake-you-think.com/films. America isn't a nation, the United States is a corporation, and that's according to Title 28 U.S. Code 3002, Section 15A, which says that the United States is a federal corporation, an agency, department, commission, board, or other entity of the United States, or an instrumentality of the United States. And based on this U.S. code alone, we can easily determine that the states have united to incorporate themselves in order to do business as the United States, meaning that the states of America are in fact their own individual corporations. Therefore, it is not impossible to create your very own state, simply because it is not impossible to create your own business. And if you think about that for a while, then maybe you'll notice something else that is important to note here, but somehow manages to be overlooked by many. Each corporation that has ever been formulated, whether past or present, has one or more owners, because if they didn't, then the corporation would not exist otherwise. And since all 51 states of America are in fact their own individual corporations, then each of these states individually have owners, or someone in ownership of the title to the land or territory now commonly referred to as states, countries, or cities throughout Turtle Island. I'm sure many of you didn't really look at it that way, so allow me to explain. Now, this is also great for genealogy purposes concerning records of information to have in your possession of ownership. Millions of the indigenous Niji were landowners and sharecroppers that formerly worked on farms, or they could have been masters in other fields like business ownership and architecture, landscaping, shipbuilding, carpentry, or even train conducting or bricklaying, just to name a few things. But what's very important to note here is how prosperous the Niji were as capitalists during the 19th century, because this gets overlooked by our very own people due to how they were taught and compulsory educated by indoctrinating curriculums embedded with political collusion under the color of law. And based on records held by the National Archives on how many acres of land was owned by the Niji during this time period, we can easily determine where the solution resides when it comes to fixing many commonly known problems that we face as a people here in America today. What took place for our people to mysteriously become the tenants when they were originally the landowners? When it comes to the laws of the lands, the use of the word tenant represented various meanings at law. Most of you are familiar with the word tenant referring to a person that rents a place or piece of land. And according to the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary, the word tenant is defined as a person holding land or other real estate under another, either by grant, lease, or at will. One who has the occupation or temporary possession of lands or tenements whose title is in another. Like if you were to lease a car or mortgage a house or even buy music online. However, you don't really own these particular properties that you purchased or rather borrowed. But there's also another side of the word tenant that is not commonly known that exposes the answer to the question I asked earlier. A tenant can also be the owner of their property or estate. simply because a tenant can own and occupy a property or estate they own. Or another example is when the original owner of a property or estate is leasing the property out to tenants, but then the owner dies, and the property then becomes possessions of the tenants, occupying the estate under the color of law. For example, a person can own property by purchasing it in full. However, the state or estate in which the property resides in is the title holder of the land, meaning that the owner of the estate or estate also owns everything within its specified boundaries, not excluding any personal or real property owned by another person or company residing within that same location. Now, to get a better understanding of this uncommonly known usage of the word tenant, one must be cognizant of the use of the word estate in this sense. Listen closely. According to the 6th edition of the Black's Law Dictionary of 1891, the word estate is defined as, quote, the degree, quantity, nature, and extent of interest which a person has in real and personal property. An estate in lands, tenements, and hereditaments signifies such interests as the tenant has therein. End quote. So where it says an estate in lands, tenements, and hereditaments signifies such interests as the tenant has therein, this alone indicates to the public that this particular type of tenant has ownership of an estate in lands, because an owner and a tenant allegedly shares the same right or interest in said property or estate somehow. The definition reads on and says, quote, the condition of circumstance in which the owner stands with regard to his property. In this sense, estate is commonly used in conveyances in connection with the words right, title, and interest, and is in a great degree synonymous with all of them. End quote. So, in other words, the word interest was another way of saying the word right. So when you read the definition of estate again, you'll see how the tables were turned to allow the tenants to become the landlords in this sense, which also reveals how a tenant does not need to reside in the state or estate they own, exposing why the letter A was dropped from the USA, because those who own the titles or rights or interests of the states don't live here to begin with. And as simple as creating a business is, one can also create their own counties, dividing up larger states by jurisdictional law and order, using surnames or rather nicknames to distinguish between which corporations or businesses have rights or what they call interests in the said territories abroad. Mind you that all of this was occurring prior to the circulation of federal notes in the 1900s. In the 6th edition of the Black's Law Dictionary, the word county is defined as the largest territorial division for local government in state. Its powers and importance vary from state to state, and as well within the given state. In certain New England states, it exists mainly for judicial administration. In Louisiana, the equivalent unit is called a parish. Counties are held in some jurisdictions to be municipal corporations and are sometimes said to be involuntary municipal corporations. Other cases, seeking to distinguish between the two, hold that counties are agencies or political subdivisions of the state for governmental purposes, and not, like municipal corporations, incorporations of the inhabitants of specified regions for purposes of local government. Counties are also said to be merely quasi-corporations. End quote. So now, the word quasi means, quote, as if or almost as it were. So quasi-corporations are, simply put, wannabes, or entities that appear to be something that they are not. So if any county of any state is a quasi-corporation, then what does that make the state? The exact same thing. Because again, a state or estate is merely nothing more than property of a said corporation. But who gave that corporation the right or interest in that said property in the first place? How can foreign corporations unanimously become owners of this sovereign land that wasn't for sale to begin with? Now, what I'm about to state next is very essential when considering information that's available now to answer these questions I just proposed to you. Each corporation has their own president, vice president, treasurer, board of trustees, and other executive positions of authoritarian entitlement. And this also reflects the operational bodies of each state government in America. The estate or state is divided into sectional counties that are controlled or rather managed by a county, which is in Old English law, quote, the most eminent dignity of a subject before the conquest. So this county subject, or person rather, is very important to note here, because in feudal law, a conquest is, quote, an acquisition by purchase. Any method of acquiring the ownership of an estate other than by descent. Also, an estate acquired otherwise than by inheritance. So the county oversaw the acquisition of land to be handed over from somebody who was obviously the original owner or occupant of that land to the state or estate or quasi-corporation. But how is this so? Reading further into the definition of conquest, it reveals that it is an international law that is the, quote, acquisition of the sovereignty of a country by force of arms, exercised by an independent power which reduces the vanquished to the submission of its empire, to conquer a territory or nation by means of force. This means that a county is nothing more than a state governor in charge of overseeing the fraudulent acquisition of this land by the force of foreign use. And here's what I mean by that. The legal definition of the word use is, quote, a confidence reposed in another who was made tenant of the land or terra tenant, that he would dispose of the land according to the intention of the cess-to-K use, or him to whose use it was granted, and suffer him to take the profits. Side note, cess-to-K is an old French word for a beneficiary of trust or a beneficiary of use. It continues on by saying that enjoyment of property, which consists in its employment, occupation, exercise, or practice, a right in one person, called the cess-to-K use, to take the profits of land of which another has the legal title and possession, together with the duty of defending the same, and of making estates thereof, according to the direction of the cess-to-K use. And the legal definition of use continues on and says, uses and trusts are not so much different things as different aspects of the same subject. A use regards principally the beneficial interests. A trust regards principally the nominal ownership. The usage of the two terms is, however, widely different. The word use is employed to denote either an estate vested since the statute of uses and by force of that statute, or to denote such an estate created before the statute as, had it been created since, would have become a legal estate by force of the statute. The word trust is employed since that statute to denote the relation between the party invested with the legal estate, whether by force of that statute or independently of it, and the party beneficially entitled, who has hitherto been said to have the equitable estate." End quote. So, in other words, the complexity of the confiscation of our lands was not due to just wars alone and people suffering from being relocated to other parts of the land and even other continents of the world. Now you see that it gets a lot deeper than that. Earlier, I mentioned in the legal definition of the word county that, quote, in Louisiana, the equivalent unit is called a parish. A parish in the Christian church is a small administrative district, typically having its own church and a priest or pastor. So if a parish is equivalent to a county, then obviously it is a corporation doing business as a church. But then that also means that a pastor of a church would be its governor. And we know this to be true because of who the government hired or selected to replace the chiefs of all of the indigenous tribes of Turtle Island in order to quell the wars without any physical battle, but by way of mental submission, exposing that the government has and can pose as any institution they create, as long as they are in possession of the lands without your knowledge of their temporary visit. Mind you, that the U.S. Constitution is commonly referred to as the rights of the people. But what's not so commonly known or publicized is that the U.S. Constitution was utilized for the benefit of each state or a state of a quasi-corporation in order to conduct intercourse with the people of the land they have forcefully acquired by way of paper genocide, without revealing their true identities nor locations of origin to the public. Oh, see you everyone. Now, this segment is part 2 of my series in which I will pick things up where I left off in part 1, where I shared detailed information concerning methods utilized by foreigners to inject their own form of government upon the sovereign lands of Turtle Island, now referred to as America. And these methods by way of acts, treaties, and statutes became the laws of the land that Americans inadvertently abide by still today, making it possible for foreign corporations to create their own countries, cities, and states in order to lawfully conduct intercourse with the original inhabitants of this land, who are the Niji, which also means that it is not impossible for you to create your own country, simply because it is not impossible to create your own business. And that still may seem like an impossible task to you due to what you are told about this government and how it operates. But to borrow a quote from poet Edgar Allan Poe, believe nothing you hear and only one half that you see. During part 1 of this series, I exposed that countries and churches are one and the same. And the reason why I pointed that out was to also inform you that the American government was founded by the likes of various denominations of Christianity, and the majority of its laws or policies stems directly from traditional practices generally observed from this form of religion. And we know this to be true because of how popular religion is in the political realm. Even during the time period of George Washington's farewell address, for example, which was alleged to have been given in 1796, where he discusses how successful the government has become due to the implementation of religion, saying, quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which led to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supporters." Which should make you ask some questions, like, does religion actually exist in government policy? And if it does, then which religious organization or corporation is mysteriously chosen to dictate the outcome of these policies? And how does that work when not every religion is represented in the government today? And to answer that point, does a policymaker have the right to show favoritism towards their specified believers while policy making? See there? Could that be the reason why Thomas Jefferson advocated for the separation of church and state?
I'm not suggesting that every progressive suddenly latch on to religious terminology. That can be dangerous. Nothing's more transparent than inauthentic expressions of faith. As Jim mentioned, the politicians who come and they're clapping kind of off rhythm to the choir. We don't need that. In fact, because I do not believe that religious people have a monopoly on morality, I would rather have someone who is grounded in morality and ethics and who is also secular affirm their morality and their ethics and their values without pretending that there's something they're not. They don't need to do that. None of us need to do that. But what I am suggesting is this: secularists are wrong when they ask believers to leave their religion at the door before entering into the public square. Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, William Jennings Bryan, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, the majority of the great reformers in American history were not only motivated by faith, but they repeatedly used religious language to argue for their cause. So to say that men and women should not inject their, quote, personal morality into public policy debates is a practical absurdity. Our law is by definition a codification of our morality, much of it which is grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Moreover, if we progressives shed some of these biases, we might recognize some overlapping values that both religious and secular people share when it comes to the moral and material direction of our country. We might recognize that the call to sacrifice on behalf of the next generation, the need to think in terms of thou and not just I, resonates in religious congregations all across the country. We might realize that we have the ability to reach out to the evangelical community and engage millions of religious Americans in the larger project of American renewal. And some of this is already beginning to happen. Pastors, friends of mine like Rick Warren and T.D. Jakes are wielding their enormous influence to confront AIDS, third world debt relief, and the genocide in Darfur. You've got religious thinkers and activists like our good friend Jim Wallace and Tony Campolo, who are lifting up the biblical injunction to help the poor as a means of mobilizing Christians against budget cuts to social programs and growing inequality. And by the way, we need Christians on Capitol Hill, and we need Jews on Capitol Hill and Muslims on Capitol Hill. When you've got an estate tax that is talking about $1 trillion being taken out of social programs to go to a handful of folks who don't need it and weren't even asking for it, we need an injection of morality into our political debate. Across the country, individual churches like my own and your own are sponsoring daycare programs and building senior centers and helping ex-offenders reclaim their lives and rebuilding the Gulf Coast in the aftermath of Katrina. So the question is, how do we build on these still tentative partnerships between religious and secular people of goodwill? It's going to take more work, a lot more work than we've done so far. The tensions and the suspicions on each side of the religious divide will have to be squarely addressed, and each side will need to accept some ground rules for collaboration. while I've already laid out some of the work that progressive leaders need to do on this, I want to talk a little bit about what conservative leaders also need to do. Some truths they need to acknowledge. For one thing, they need to understand the critical role of the separation of church and state in not just preserving our democracy, but the robustness of our religious practice. You know, that, I mean, folks tend to forget, during our founding, it wasn't the atheists and the civil libertarians who were the most effective champions of the First Amendment. It was the persecuted minorities. It was Baptists like John Leland, who didn't want the Congregationalists and the established churches from imposing their views on folks who were getting happy out in the fields and teaching Scripture to slaves. It was the forebears of the evangelicals who were the most adamant about not mingling government with religion, because they did not want state-sponsored religion hindering their ability to practice their faith as they understood it. And moreover, given the increasing diversity of America's populations, the dangers of sectarianism are greater than ever. Whatever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers. And even if we did have only Christians in our midst, if we expelled every non-Christian from the United States of America, whose Christianity would we teach in the schools? Would it be James Dobson's or Al Sharpton's? Which passages of Scripture should guide our public policy? Should we go with Leviticus, which suggests slavery is okay, and that eating shellfish is an abomination? Or we could go with Deuteronomy, which suggests stoning your child if he strays from the faith? Or should we just stick to the Sermon on the Mount, a passage that is so radical that it's doubtful that our own Defense Department would survive its application? So before we get carried away, let's read our Bibles now. Folks haven't been reading their Bible. Folks haven't been reading their Bible. Folks haven't been reading their Bible. Folks haven't been reading their Bible.
This means that a form of religion does in fact influence government policy still today, to the point where there is no actual separation between the church and the state, simply because imposing policies in a state is the exact same as imposing religious beliefs in a church. According to the Britannica Encyclopedia on the subject of church and state, it says that, quote, in the 17th century, there were few who believed that diversity of religious belief in a church unconnected with the civil power were possible in a unified state. Common religious standards were looked upon as a principal support of the political order. The Puritans, for example, who fled religious persecution in England in the 17th century, enforced rigid conformity to church ideas among settlers in the American colonies. Side note, the word Puritanism is, quote, a religious reform movement in the late 16th and 17th centuries that sought to purify the Church of England of the remnants of the Roman Catholic popery that the Puritan claimed had been retained after the religious settlement reached early in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Puritans became noted in the 17th century for a spirit of moral and religious earnestness that informed their whole way of life, and they sought through church reform to make their lifestyle the pattern for the whole nation. Their efforts to transform the nation contributed both to civil war in England and to the founding of colonies in America as working models of the Puritan way of life.
Our Constitution opens with the words, as trite as it sounds, we the people. Well, it's time to remember that we the people are the government. Well, it's time to remember that we the people are the government. You and I. Not some force in a distant capital. Not some powerful force that we have no control over. It's us. It's we the people. In another era, when our democracy was tested, Franklin Roosevelt reminded us, in America, we do our part. We all do our part. That's all I'm asking. That we do our part, all of us. If we do that, we will meet the center challenge of the age by proving that democracy is durable and strong. Autocrats will not win the future. We will. America will. And the future belongs to America.
What's also important to note here are the companies, or rather corporations, that are said to be responsible for allegedly founding the states or estates of America, according to what the mysterious writers of American history claims. It was said that the Church of England and the congregational churches, meaning the Protestant churches, were the missionaries who propagated the gospel in foreign parts to them, because they are not primordial inhabitants of Turtle Island, known as America.
I'm grateful for your generous invitation to state my views. While the so-called religious issue is necessarily and properly the chief topic here tonight, I want to emphasize from the outset that I believe that we have far more critical issues in the 1960 campaign. The spread of communist influence until it now festers only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The humiliating treatment of our president and vice president by those who no longer respect our power. The hungry children I saw in West Virginia. The old people who cannot pay their doctor's bills. The families forced to give up their farms. An America with too many slums, with too few schools, and too late to the moon and outer space. These are the real issues which should decide this campaign. And they are not religious issues. For war and hunger and ignorance and despair, no religious barrier. But because I am a Catholic, and no Catholic has ever been elected president, the real issues in this campaign have been obscured, perhaps deliberately, in some quarters less responsible than this. So it is apparently necessary for me to state once again, not what kind of church I believe in, for that should be important only to me, but what kind of America I believe in. I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote.
So now you know which religion was chosen to influence governmental policies in America, still to this very day. And both the church and the state are said to be good things because they somehow fill an imaginary gap that some people believe they need, as if they are not naturally born with it individually. Like, for example, life principles, or even making their own moral decisions without living in fear of actually accrediting themselves for setting personal goals and achieving them, instead of giving that credit towards a stranger. So realistically, you must be cognizant that an enemy may appear as if it is the light, when it's all an illusion, due to reality being based upon what you can see done in the dark. Like, if you were to ever create your own country, for example, you are in fact guaranteed protection under your own right. And the government also guarantees this protection as your right. In the First Amendment, of the U.S. Constitution, where it says, quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Now, obviously, people would generally associate the freedom to assemble, or rather known as freedom of assembly, as a constitutional right that guarantees the protection of an individual to assemble. For example, a protest against some government policy, or the protection against any government interference with an individual assembling their own place of worship, or maybe even to speak freely at their own public or private conference. And while that's all true, it does, however, extend to a greater measure and degree when it comes to fundamental human rights. We can all agree that the words of the English language carry double or more meanings. So when it comes to the words utilized throughout the U.S. Constitution, there is no exception. So where the First Amendment states peaceably to assemble, the word peaceably can be interpreted by the mind relating to being nonviolent. And that's true, but it also carries a legal meaning, which is having the right or freedom to associate. The tranquility enjoyed by a political society internally by the good order which reigns amongst its members, and externally by the good understanding it has with all other nations. Now, that may ring a bell with some of you who are familiar with hearing the term freedom of association, which is normally used interchangeably with freedom of assembly, indicating that they are in fact one and the same. More about that in a moment. The First Amendment states that, quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble, which also indicates that the right of the people is such a basic human right that constitutionally any government is forbidden from trespassing your choice of association. Or in other words, you reserve the right to be associated with any corporation, society, organization, or government as you please, and any other said government cannot interfere. This very point is also echoed in the definition of constitutional liberty or freedom in the Black's Law Dictionary, stating, quote, such freedom as is enjoyed by citizens of a country or state under the protection of its constitution, the aggregate of those personal, civil, and political rights of the individual, which are guaranteed by the Constitution and secured against invasion by the government or any of its agencies. So with that being said, we can easily determine that a government is nothing more than an organization, and Congress is another way of saying assembly. Listen closely. The word Congress is defined as a large formal meeting of representatives from countries or societies at which ideas are discussed and information is exchanged. And then the word assembly is defined as, quote, the concourse or meeting together of a considerable number of persons at the same place, also the persons so gathered. Popular assemblies are those where the people meet to deliberate upon their rights. These are guaranteed by the Constitution. End quote. Now, I mentioned earlier that the term freedom of assembly is commonly used interchangeably with freedom of association. It is defined as, quote, the right to be with other people for a legal reason, cause, or purpose with no bias or interference. A government may be required to allow its citizens to join a particular organization. The bylaws of the organization may yet prohibit accepting some and excluding others. So, in conclusion, creating your own country or county or state is not only achievable, but it is also your fundamental human right. And that right is even protected and guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution.
So whenever you get tired of marching and protesting and reposting hashtags in hopes that things would change for the better, just note that when you get good and ready, you reserve the right to assemble your very own freedom.
I'm just here to make you think.